Welcome everyone to Gems from the Wisdom Traditions, a conversation circle sponsored by Stella Moving Center each Saturday afternoon or evening, depending on where you might be. We are following last week's theme of sacred human geometry. And in fact, before the end of today's session, I am going to be leading a workshop that involves human geometry. So I'm going to be able to pass the baton to my husband, Cliff, who is here at that point in time. But I wanted to link it up with this week's theme of involution and evolution, in the way that as spirit is descending into matter for its ascent back out of matter, back up into spirit again, there is a very logical, geometrical, parageometrical unfoldment that happens. For this is not a random process. And I think that we'll be hearing more about that from these two gentlemen. I have with me Elton Hall and John Powers, both of whom Cliff and I have known for the last half century, and both of whom have been students of Theosophy all of that time. They've shared great insight with us ever since we've known them, and I'm sure they will share quite a bit with both of you. You will have noticed perhaps in your invitation that they have spoken for us before, and we gave links, one for each of them, although they've spoken more to different presentations they've given in the past. So if you'd like to do a follow-up, look at your invitation, and you'll be able to see some of the things they've mentioned previously. It's really thrilling to have all of you here. Cliff, do you want to say anything more about John and Elton before they proceed?
But yeah, sure. In just a few brief words, I think we're in for a real treat today, both with the subject matter, which maybe many people have never really been exposed to, the idea of involution and evolution together as kind of a joined teaching or concept that comes from ancient times, passed down from seers or rishis over millennia. But also we're in for a real treat with the two speakers, Elton and John. As Renee said, they've been teachers of ours for 50 years. I remember going into a Elton's class at UCSB to hear about Plato's cave almost exactly in 1975, 50 years ago, and that was so inspiring. And John has been a teacher of ours too all these years. So with no further ado, I'm going to let them, or let Renee, I'm going to let them take on this wonderful subject, which I think it really, just in a nutshell, would say it gives much more depth to evolution than science does. It gives much more depth to the ideas of creation than most of the religious traditions do. But it joins the two ideas, religion and science, in a deeper way that gives all of us more purpose, meaning, place in the scheme of things, and also the idea of free will really works into the whole concept of involution and evolution. So take it away, gentlemen.
And let me just say in advance, everyone, that since we get to have the double privilege of two speakers, we've extended the time to 4:15 today, so an extra 15 minutes.
Well, thank you, Renee and Cliff, for raising the bar so high. Now we move forward with trepidation. I'm going to talk about involution, and John will talk about evolution. Within the last century and a quarter, the sciences, especially physics and the biological sciences, have brought human thinking ever closer to the teachings of Theosophy. Theosophy is the name of the knowledge that has always been the source of all religion, philosophy, and science, which, when fully understood, are found to be one. This idea of a single source of everything, physical, mental, and spiritual, has driven humanity's search for understanding from the beginning of recorded history and from long before. For example, biology in the last 50 years has increasingly discovered the immense complexity of life, including our radical interdependence. In discovering that even the human body is full of microbes, essential for the digestion and assimilation of energy for life, and that cells function both independently and in the unity that makes a whole living organism. Physics has increasingly discerned the complexity of physical matter, from atoms to particles within particles, all of which are waves until observed. The vibratory nature of existence is no longer even a question. Yet the ultimate source of all that exists remains a mystery. Biology cannot explain how life arose from non-living stuff. The laws of physics break down, dissolve, when one approaches near the so-called Big Bang. Put simply, why is there something rather than nothing, is a question that we cannot answer even with all of our contemporary knowledge and methods of exploration. Throughout history and in every culture and civilization that have left records, we find profound thinkers wrestling with the question, how does the source of everything diversify into the myriad things we find in our experience? This is the problem of the one, the origin and source, and the many, the diversified world in which we live. The ancient Greeks, Hindus, Buddhists, Taoists, Zoroastrians, Jains, Hebrews, and Christians have all sought to answer this question. In fact, all religions, philosophies, and sciences have struggled with this fundamental issue. Evolution as a theory has much in its favor. Indeed, it's not just a theory, as that word is typically used, it is a fact in nature. But biologists today know that it is incomplete. They observe slime molds without cells or brains, finding the shortest route to nutrition. Watch octopus tentacles operating independently of the brain of the octopus, yet working together when that brain needs them to do so. Note the way birds find materials to build nests, and fish create areas for females to deposit their eggs. Biologists cannot help but use the language of intention and purpose to describe their discoveries. For instance, this bird dances in such and such a way to attract a mate. That's purpose. Yet neo-Darwinian theory denies purpose, even while having to use the language of purpose to discuss the development of life over the millennia. All this is changing. An increasing number of physicists are insisting that consciousness plays a role in the evolution of the universe. And a growing chorus of biologists are suggesting that we have to use the language of purpose in the evolution of life because there is purpose in the evolution of life. This is old news to theosophy. It is always taught under many names that all existence is alive, conscious, and purposive. Of course, the further removed from human consciousness any creature or thing is, the less able we are to understand what that consciousness is like. Anyone who has loved a dog or a cat knows that their consciousness, and they are obviously conscious, is a mystery to us. Yes, they are like us in some ways, seemingly to know when it is time to be fed, calculating a jump upon the couch, enjoying a kind of affection, knowing when their name is called. But they are alien in so many other ways. What are they doing when they stand and stare? Do they dream? And if so, what are their dreams? How do they mentally map a territory so that they know their way around it? When considering mice or birds or insects, we can't imagine their consciousness. And when it comes to microbes, viruses, and even minerals, we are at a total loss, not even recognizing consciousness at all. This is our problem, not nature's. Theosophy teaches that consciousness pervades the universe, as much there from the beginning as subatomic particles were. Just as physicists cannot determine whether the universe came from a big bang, what banged? Nothing. Or whether the universe undergoes an expansion and collapse into a big bounce, the idea of pulsation, of unfoldment and withdrawal, pervades existence. We see it in the pulse of day and night, the seasons, the beatings of our hearts, the rhythm of our breathing, the pattern of our waking and sleeping. From a theosophical point of view, all these are reflections in diversity of the pulse of existence itself. Professor Rogoff and Iyer put it this way, quote, witnessed from the standpoint of eternal duration, the entire changing universe is but a kaleidoscopic reflection of divine thought in the divine mind. And just as this pulse pervades everything at every level, from the pulsing gluons within the atom's nucleus to the vibrating strings that string theory believes makes up matter, to the life of stars. And it is so for the human being. Theosophy teaches reincarnation, the succession of what we are spiritually in body after body through time. We reflect the pulse of existence in our succession of embodiments. Within the laws of nature, the overarching principle is karma, the intelligent law of rebalancing whatever goes out of balance. In a universe ever in movement, causes and effects that in turn are causes of further effects, and the laws of nature aim to describe this ceaseless activity. Just as physics has discovered some of the laws of material nature, there are laws of mental and spiritual nature as well, though they lay outside the parameters that the methodology of physical science imposes upon itself. One must turn elsewhere to discern them, to philosophy and religion, and one's inner experiences. Well, we tend to use the word evolution for the whole process that is the universe. Theosophy acknowledges this pulsation and uses the terms involution and evolution to distinguish the outflow and inflow of this activity. Nothing can be without the conditions for its manifestation being present, and those conditions are also evolving. Theosophy recognizes three broad strains in this process: physical, mental, and spiritual. There is only one substance, which means that what we call spiritual is the most ethereal matter, and what we call physical is crystallized spirit, so to say. We are dealing with a spectrum, and to understand involution and evolution, we divide this spectrum, just as light passing through the prism separates into the 7 colors of the rainbow, so they are all just the light. Involution is the process of bringing the different dimensions of the spirit-matter spectrum together in such a way that self-consciousness can appear. The word exist comes from the Latin ex and stare, literally to stand out from. For something to exist, it must stand out from some background. All manifestation, the whole universe, requires the spirit-matter spectrum to exist. The divine mind requires cosmic matter as a vehicle or platform to express cosmic ideation. This expression allows for involution, just as cosmic spirit is the aim of evolution. At the microcosmic level, a vehicle is necessary for that ideation to emerge as I am I, that is, as individual consciousness. At this stage of evolution, a suitable physical body is required, for such self-consciousness to manifest. This, of course, is the human being. In order to achieve self-consciousness, lower levels of consciousness must combine in ways that bring minerals together to manifest as plants, then animals, and finally, human beings. This ever more complex development allows for consciousness to grow in awareness and ever more effectively respond to environments. So such development is paralleled by mentally being expressed in ever more sophisticated ways. But this can only go so far. The spiritual end of the spectrum, already conscious, but unable to manifest on the physical plane, must wait until a form or vehicle suitable for such manifestation is developed. The human being is that development. When ready, the spiritual dimension can manifest, and this is self-consciousness. This is the culmination of the involution phase of the beating heart of existence. At this point, a new process in evolution emerges. With self-consciousness, the processes of consciousness that we call instinct and genetic propensity, and even the laws of physics, all of which continue their activities, are joined by self-conscious choice, by vision, and by understanding. Human beings necessarily engage the process of evolution and take on the task, whether they want to or not, of furthering evolution. We should note that this characterization of the human being is not physical or biological. There may be self-conscious beings elsewhere in the galaxy or universe, and if so, they are human beings in this sense, though their physical appearance may be quite different from ours and may not even be physical in any sense we recognize. Even a study of the human organism, the body, shows that the complexity involved in this process is immense and hardly reducible to a few words. Theosophy teaches that the process of involution includes increasing concretization of the mental material dimension of existence. The emerging human being begins ethereally, where the spiritual side was not seemingly divided by individual bodies, and humanity experienced life as one. Eventually, the human body became concrete through a long process and emerged as such about 18 million years ago. This process reflects the one-many issue at the human level. 5 million years ago, the mental dimension was awakened to self-consciousness, and so we began to find ourselves as we are today. Individuality separated us one from another, but we were still in harmony. Unfortunately, we as spiritual beings with self-conscious mental capacity began to mistake the instruments we use in embodied existence for what we are. In mistakenly turning away from our spiritual nature, we erroneously identify the personality and physical body for what we really are, and thus we find ourselves distinct and separate from one another. As even biology shows, this separation is only seeming, since we cannot for a moment exist without the rest of nature, breathing, eating, relying on one another for birth, food, shelter, everything in nature, everything in life. Our task as self-conscious beings is to experience and learn and to self-consciously recognize and come to manifest the unity that we really are. This is the point of evolution. In one fundamental sense, we are now on the path of returning to that unity which we once were, but we must do so self-consciously. This means that our experience in our seemingly separate bodily existences, increasingly self-consciously undertaken by us as we learn from experience and discern the meaning of our existence, we bring self-conscious awareness to our unity, to that original unity that we ultimately are. Since we are radically interconnected with and independent on everything that exists, this deliberate effort uplifts all nature toward self-consciousness. Not only are we self-consciously involved in our own evolution, we are now consciously involved in all evolution. Theosophy teaches that humanity, and therefore every individual, is on a vast pilgrimage of individual and collective enlightenment. Involution is just half of that pilgrimage. John.
Elton. Thank you. That was wonderful, Elton. We've been friends and colleagues for over 50 years now, and it just keeps getting better. So thank you for that. So to continue our discussion of the theme, involution and evolution, I'd like to focus on the second half of the topics, and Elton's covered the first half splendidly. And that's the area of our lives that most concerns us in this talk. Now, Elton and I are both talking from the standpoint of what we know about the teachings of Theosophy. So we're trying to present with as much fidelity to the teachings as we can what those teachings have to say about our future evolution, because we know from both our study of the wisdom religion and some years of experience on this planet that human beings actually do have the keys to their own growth in their hands. So H.P. Blavatsky makes reference to this idea in her presentation of what's called the three fundamental propositions of the secret doctrine, particularly the third one, in which she says that, quote, through the cycle of incarnation or necessity in accordance with cyclic and karmic law, no purely spiritual buddhi, a divine soul, can have an independent, that is, conscious existence before the spark which issued from the pure essence of the unknown, the oversoul, has A, passed through every elemental form of the phenomenal world of that manvantara, and B, acquired individuality, first by natural impulse and then by self-induced and self-devised efforts, checked by its karma, thus ascending through all the degrees of intelligence from the lowest to the highest manas, from mineral and plant up to the holiest archangel or Dhyani Buddha. The pivotal doctrine of the esoteric philosophy admits no privileges or special gifts in man, save those won by his own ego through personal effort and merit throughout a long series of metempsychoses and reincarnations, unquote. So there's several points that we'd like to note here. First, HPB is describing a very, very long arc of human evolution covering hundreds of millions of years. And given the logic of that evolutionary pilgrimage that she described, we're led to state several other propositions, postulates. One, if there has been an involution of spirit into matter, there must be an evolution of spirit out of matter. Makes sense. If the descending arc of evolution is compared philosophically to the one becoming the many, as Elton mentioned, then the ascending arc may be viewed as the many re-becoming the one. And third, the evolutionary impulse behind spirit, that is consciousness, has shifted from an involution into matter by natural impulse to an evolution out of matter by self-induced and self-devised efforts. And fourthly, the central task in this phase of the overall evolutionary cycle is to restore individual monastic initiative, that is, the ability to think things through ahead of time and to take steps to prepare for the future. In relation to number one, the descent of spirit into matter and the evolution of spirit out of matter is a pivotal concept. In the Secret Doctrine, HPB explains that as spirit, or the original primordial unity, descends into matter, becoming increasingly material until it reaches the densest state, it is also seemingly fragmented into a multiplicity of beings at many levels of matter and consciousness. And when the descent of consciousness and differentiation of matter and form reach their most extreme state, the process changes to the return ascent of consciousness towards a unitary state of being and the dissolving of the differentiations of matter and form, so that matter thenceforth will become increasingly more rarefied and take on less and less complex forms. So in the present cycle, we've now begun the evolution of spirit out of matter, returning both spirit and matter back to the original spiritual state of primordial unity and homogeneity, but along with the inconceivable wisdom gained from the experience of all the beings over the entire Manvantara, over the entire universe. And the Manvantara, by the way, is one full period of manifestation for our solar system. From the time it's born till the time it dies, it's a very long time. Thus, the one re-becomes the solitary self that retires into its parent source for an equivalent number of ages until the process of manifestation, Manvantara, has begun again. Now, the dynamics of this evolutionary process is explained by H.P. Blavatsky in The Secret Doctrine, and it depends upon two primary forces. And she says this, quote, "We are taught that the transformations through which man passed on the descending arc, which is centrifugal for spirit and centripetal for matter, and those he prepares to go through henceforward on his ascending path, will reverse the direction of the two forces. That is, matter will become centrifugal and spirit centripetal." So let's explain this a little bit, because sometimes even I get confused too about which is which and what they're doing. So the two forces are the centrifugal, which is the force that acts outward on a body moving around the center, pushes it out away from the center. And the centripetal is the force of an object moving around a circle in a circular path that causes it to always move towards the center of the circle. So you have, these are opposite forces. So in other words, the two forces are centrifugal for spirit, that is expanding outwards, and centripetal for matter, that is developing more and more particularized, dense, and distinct forms from an original state of homogeneity, homogeneous matter. And this operates during the involutionary phase. They change places at the midpoint of the evolutionary journey to become centripetal for spirit and centrifugal for matter. So analogously, we see a similar process reflected in the Earth's magnetic poles that reverse polarity, which typically takes several thousand years to complete. And the same reversal has been detected in the sun as well. Furthermore, the midpoint of evolution, which is where this reversal of the forces happens, was marked by 5 important events in the life of the human host. First, the full incarnation in physical vestures, as Elton described in his part. Secondly, the separation of the sexes into male and female. Thirdly, the connecting up with the higher faculties, called the lighting up of manas, the illumination of the reasoning faculties in man. Fourthly, the activation of the power of speech occurred simultaneously with the lighting up of manas, or thereabouts. And fifthly, the manifestation of the full set of 5 senses. So when that midpoint of evolution was reached and the evolutionary centrifugal and centripetal forces switch places, the human host had to readjust its comprehension of the environment in which it had been living. So why does this matter? Well, it matters because during the involutionary phase, the host of what are called the human monads was virtually carried along by the evolutionary currents, as we said, by natural impulse, without having to exert themselves self-consciously to participate in the evolutionary pilgrimage. They were being carried along without having to sign on to the whole enterprise, like occupants in a raft going down the river. As Professor Iyer explains in his essay, Spirit, Mind, and Matter, quote, during the descending cycles of manifestation, spirit works centrifugally by diffusion of light in every direction. Matter, on the other hand, works by concentration and condensation, becoming harder and denser and absorbing into itself various essences. This process confuses human beings. They experience a distinct gap between spirit and matter, are seemingly caught in what is purely the shadowy side or external aspect of nature. But having passed the midpoint at which astral potentials are merged into physical forms, humanity is moving towards a comparable future point when physical existence will dissipate and evaporate through a remerging into subtle substance. On the ascending arc of the process, matter will become what spirit was. Matter will become more etherealized, looser, less concrete. It will begin to etherealize itself. Spirit, on the other hand, will be characterized by greater freedom in inner concentration. As spirit frees itself from confinement in the grossest matter, while matter is etherealizing itself, consciousness becomes more individuated on the plane of ideation, yet more universal in its sentient contact with all of manifestation. Spirit is drawing itself more and more inwardly into itself, and so recovering the pristine potential and potency of the logos that was and is at the heart of all life and nature. That's from the Gupta Vidya. So we can see from these passages that during the first half of Manvantara, humans were carried along by the evolutionary forces. During the second half of Manvantara, humans have to consciously exert themselves, a point made by Elton, by self-induced and self-devised efforts to fully participate in the work of the perfection of the human soul, the ultimate goal of spiritual evolution. Therefore, we could say that the central task in this phase of the evolutionary cycle is to restore individual initiative, proposition number 4 up above, rather than be buffeted about by the worldly winds of accidental change. We must engage with the self-conscious task of taking our life into our own hands, directing our intellectual and spiritual evolution towards self-chosen ideals and principles. At this point, we can ask ourselves, okay, so what exactly do we mean by spiritual evolution? Well, in the words of the Secret Doctrine, again, that has to do with the evolution of the human spiritual to the divine spiritual, the complete unfoldment and realization in incarnated life of all the magnificent spiritual powers and potencies carried within the immortal vestures of human beings. Spiritual evolution involves the return to a state of moral purity and mental reliability, unfolding the powers of meditation, of creating thought forms for the use of other minds, forms that reflect the archetypal logic of divine mind, which is enhanced by developing an effortless resonance with the minds and hearts of other spiritual aspirants, and thus drawing closer to and becoming attuned to the collective mind and heart, the living center of universal humanity. Withdrawing from over-involvement with the sensorium and mundane concerns, developing the ability to ascend to transcendental states of consciousness in meditation, using the innate powers of concentration, contemplation, and continuity of consciousness in spirit, not in matter. The mystical seeker concerned to awaken the compassionate, creative capacity of the higher faculties must turn from a half-life of outwardness to a full life of inwardness by progressively withdrawing attention from the phenomenal plane and intensifying the power of concentration combined with viraga. He must detach his mind from the world and the concerns of the separative self. As he does this, the polarity of the linga sharira, the astral form, which is the seat of the subtle sensory powers, will change. There follows a gradual unfoldment from within, without, bringing an attunement to supersensuous spheres of consciousness and a correlative extension and integration of the range and scope of perception, unquote. Now, human beings generally suppose that the five senses we currently use have more or less always been part of the human equipment, that they sort of all just appeared together in the human form somehow. Theosophically, this isn't the case. We know from our reading of The Secret Doctrine that the development of our five senses is inextricably tied to the development of the cosmic elements, beginning with ether, then air, fire, light, water, and earth. And with the appearance of each element over time on our plane, another of the senses becomes available for use. Thus, beginning in the first root race in this round, the sense of hearing was available to humans as the element of akasha was predominating. The sense of touch was added to the human complement with the appearance of air, and so on for each subrace. Thus, as the evolutionary impulse brings into being newer subraces, the fundamental perceptual faculty of the ego developed further, but became fragmented from its primordial unitary condition into a state of differentiated sensory centers. In other words, we began with one perceptual ability, which then got deployed into these five separate avenues, which actually caused a problem to the extent to which this evolutionary development was driven by the speeding up in the mental evolution of the ego. We can call it a fall, a natural fall of the human being from a state of, almost near omniscience into a state of illusion, actually. However, with the added burden placed upon that evolution by the development of humans' fixation upon form over essence, there was such a terrible weight upon human spiritual perception that it said the third eye, the eye of Dhamma, closed, and humans have struggled ever since to recover their primordial purity of spiritual perception, that vast and nearly unlimited ability to stretch the limits of perception. In those days, humans experienced a state of near omniscience, and human beings were like gods. As Professor Iyer noted in his essay on Involution, in the third root race of the present round as self-consciousness dawned, humanity was in a state of blissful primordial spirituality. Human beings felt effortlessly at one with one another on the plane of divine ideation, universal compassion, and spiritual will, owing to the extraordinary intensity of spiritual perception. This authentic aboriginal condition of humanity is associated with the eye of Dengma, the third eye of spiritual insight and vision. Despite the self-inflicted damage to our primordial spiritual perception, it is still always possible to reverse the impairment and recover those perceptive powers that made early humanity nearly godlike in its effortless capacity for empathy and identification with others, reawakening the true spiritual love of humans for their fellows. The arousal of buddhi, that is, universal spiritual perception, through the efforts of self-directed manas, is a crucial part of the current cycle, and this is critically dependent upon the control of the senses by manas, which can only be accomplished by individuals inserting themselves into the larger perspective of cosmic and cyclic evolution. These teachings of theosophy point to the inextricable identity of individual growth and universal enlightenment. It's important to point out that part of this evolutionary work of current humanity is also to kindle the fires of the ancient mysteries, to create the conditions in which they may flourish as they did prior to their being driven underground around the 5th century before the current era. The reemergence of those ancient schools also requires that our civilization become hospitable to those who have always guided humanity and protected the ancient wisdom. As Mr. Judge says in one of his letters, there is a certain object for our general work. It is to start up a new force, a new current in the world, whereby great and long-gone jnanis, or wise ones, will be attracted back to incarnate among men here and there, and thus bring back the true life and the true practices. The currents of the past have decidedly shifted. The evolutionary impulse behind spirit or consciousness have shifted from an involution into matter to an evolution out of matter, which means that we can no longer maintain our former involvement with form and matter, especially with our unhealthy identification with our physical forms. We can no longer maintain the illusion of being personal separative selves who are only tangentially connected to nature. On the return journey, our orientation of thought must be redirected upwards and outwards towards the higher planes of existence that lie concealed all about us and from which we emerged in the far distant night of time. Thank you for listening.
Oh, thank you for speaking.
You're welcome.
A question that has arisen for me, if I could just start with a question, not just for Elton and for John also, but others as well who may have contemplated something like this. We can see from what both of you were presenting how important this idea of this meeting place of spirit and matter is, where there's a certain balance such that it's possible for there to be self-consciousness, for there to be free will, as Cliff mentioned at the beginning, and for there to be something in the universe that was able to now self-perpetuate or self-propel itself out of matter and back into spirit. And we call that meeting point, if we're studying something from the theosophical perspective, humanity. So as you mentioned, this could take place anywhere in the universe, and it doesn't need to look like what we think of as human beings. It's more this balance of spirit and matter that can be self-conscious. And so we have a quote in our Still a Moving Center Almanac this week for Tuesday. It's from Hermes. It says that atoms, involution and evolution, external and internal growth and development have all one and the same object, man, meaning humanity, as the highest physical and ultimate form on this earth. And a lot of people, when I have had the opportunity to take up this topic, take great exception to this idea from the point of view that that is really seeming very anthropocentric, that what about all these other special creatures in the universe, and aren't they important, and don't they have consciousness too? I mean, as Elton was mentioning, we know even our cat has consciousness and feeling. I mean, I know that our pet turtle, Greg, mourned the death of his mate for 2 to 3 weeks. A turtle this big, a little box turtle. So there is definitely feeling and consciousness, awareness amongst all these creatures that we have surrounding us. So how do we think about this idea of humanity being at the apex of evolution in a way, or how do we talk about it with people who have this objection? I imagine all of you, or both of you at least, have run into this. I wonder, and other people as well might have some thoughts along these lines.
I have a passage from an article by HPB from the Roots of Ritualism and Masonry that I'd like to read because it really addresses this point at a very fundamental level. So after setting out the nature of the immortal gods, the fathers of the human race, HPB in this article spoke of about every true theosophist holds that the divine higher self of every mortal man is of the same essence as the essence of the immortal gods. Being, moreover, endowed with free will, hence having more than they, responsibility, we regard the incarnated ego as far superior to, if not more divine, than any spiritual intelligence still awaiting incarnation. Philosophically, the reason for this is obvious, and every metaphysician of the Eastern school will understand it. The incarnated ego has odds against it which do not exist in the case of a pure divine essence unconnected with matter. The latter has no personal merit, while the former is on his way to final perfection through the trials of existence, of pain and suffering. And so it's up to each one to decide whether to make this suffering constructive, make these trials meaningful, make these tribulations a golden opportunity for self-transformation and spiritual resurrection.
In one sense, I think that concern, and I think it's a valid concern, about what they talk about anthropomorphizing everything. What one is thinking of there is taking the individual personal ego and trying to see the whole universe in light of it. The human being we're talking about is not even that ego. It is a critical, well, as you put it, the midpoint in the whole process of nature, the unfolding and the return. What we erroneously think is human personality, the various roles we play, the social status we create, the institutions we create, that's all ephemeral, and none of it has anything to do directly with what we really are. That midpoint is where we wake up to what we really are. That's self-consciousness, the ability to understand and do something about what we understand. That nice image, going down, drifting down in a raft. That midpoint we change to a canoe with paddles and start paddling upstream. And so what it turns out is, rather than thinking of the human being as kind of a special creature of nature, the human being becomes responsible in part for the evolution of nature. Well, in one sense, that is special, but it's not any different from what's involved in cats and dogs and plants. It's just a different stage of development, that's all. And that there are forces, intelligent forces in nature that have yet to go through this process that also drive nature, but it's only in the sense that here is a special place. It's a razor's edge. Because as we well know from our own experience in life, we can certainly screw it up. But that's what makes it, in other words, the specialness is the special responsibility we have, not the special status we can claim. I saw a hand somewhere and it disappeared.
Yes, it was Mariange.
Ah, there we are.
And I'm going to be phasing out, and Cliff's going to phase in here, and I can't wait to watch the the video and find out some more about.
You're going
don't become ethereal too fast.
You're going to evolve right out of here. Huh?
That's it. Thank you both so much, gentlemen. And I will say that next week we have a conversation on students of life. It's going to be led at the beginning by a Ken Small, who's going to speak on the Zen Buddhist perspective. Cliff didn't know that, so I'm inserting that into the middle here. Thank you so much. Aloha.
Mariange?
I have to admit, thank you very much. It's a whole new lexicon that I heard. I'm astounded by that. I thought it was a little more, I'm more simplistic. And so it was really stunning to walk into something so advanced, and I'm curious. So thank you. You gave me a lot of curiosity about the subject, but on a more mundane and simple way, I watched this movie, Aloha. I watched a movie called The Flow last night, and I don't know if anyone saw it, but it was the involution and the evolution and the midpoint, but it was a boat with animals collectively choosing to be to work and make their decisions and reach out. So it's really great because I was really, it was heady and intense and stimulating and all this, but thank God I watched this movie last night and saw, a crane, a bird, take the rudder, and the cat decide to bring its consciousness into all of unity, because I feel that it does show what you just said at the very end, Elton, that each of these animals has the ability to do it. I guess the decision making was very eminent in what you said, is that it's maybe one of those precipice times when we choose to decide for unity, and create this consciousness. And I think that is very hopeful. That's something that really motivates me to have a really good attitude when I wake up tomorrow, and try again. So mission accomplished from that, because it could be very discouraging sometimes, when a lot of my customers come in with this impulse to constrict and stay constricted and feel this is the end of days. But anyway, that was my comment. I don't really have a question so much as it was very well presented, and a whole nuance that I hadn't known. So thank you.
Well, thank you for your comment. As you were talking, I was reminded of in the Renaissance in Italy, in the later 1400s. A young man, he'd actually died fairly young. He was like 30 some years old, named Pico della Mirandola, wrote a stunning essay called, which we translate as Oration on the Dignity of Man. And in it, he has God say to Adam as humanity, everything that's been created has its place. Only the human being doesn't. Because the human being can turn his attention and focus and abilities toward the angelic realm and become an angel, a divine being, or can do that and turn toward the grosser nature and become an animal. The choice is yours. The thing that makes us special is not the ego or our personality and all of that. It's the fact we have a choice. And that can be seen as a blessing or a curse. I love the story you're telling about the flow, because of course those animals can't make the decisions we can make, but they can certainly figure out a great deal. If you've ever been manipulated by your pet, cat or a dog, you know how that works. My getting up schedule has changed because my dog has decided it's going to be fed at 7 o'clock. Whereas I would prefer to get up about 7:30, but no. And it has ways of conveying that, though it can't speak language. But I'm sure you've seen your cat or dog mope, stare at you with those eyes like it's just so much in need. You've seen all of that. Humans do a lot of that too. And if they're not careful, it's because they're just catering to their animal natures. So the question is always, what choices are we making? And I'm not speaking about, some life choice, though we make those. I'm speaking about the choices we make every instant during the day. In relation to that collectivity we call humanity, which is really one if we understood it properly.
Anyone else have something they'd like to contribute? Shane, Bob, Donna, I'm gonna name everybody. Come on, somebody be brave and step up.
Um, this is kind of new for me as well, but as I was listening to you, I was kind of interjecting that within matter, there is a midpoint, and I think you were talking about that midpoint, where matter becomes life. And at some point, it seems as though from the other end, we have spirit, mind, consciousness. And I'm trying to unpack these words in a way that makes sense for me because what you said in terms of life, and as it gets more and more evolved, it seems to me that somehow consciousness intersects with life in some way. And in Buddhism, we say, well, the human existence is a very special one because only the human existence has the ability to choose to be enlightened or realized. And I'm still kind of curious why that is and what's happening with those terms. In other words, is there something that's evolving within spirit that again goes from consciousness to something beyond consciousness? In other words, spirit, just as between matter and life. And I'm kind of looking for some guidelines there with realizing that these are four different elements along a continuum. And in terms of one, matter, life, consciousness, spirit is one. But in terms of our experience, there are four. I'm just wondering if you could just comment on that, or if those are terms that really don't fit into theosophy.
Uh, well, I think they kind of do. If you know, if you have studied Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism especially, you notice there's a mystery there about consciousness. Because consciousness, so to speak, goes, there is that beyond consciousness. And so the theosophical perspective, well, first, the theosophical perspective is there is nothing that is not life. Life is energically everything. So that's why I said, as consciousness rises up, and I mentioned mineral, like the Islamic Sufi poet Rumi says, I was a stone, I was a plant, but when it reaches the human level, it gets individualized in a way that allows self-consciousness to incarnate. And so we are self-conscious. Though you'll notice we can pretty well go half asleep through a day. That self-consciousness often, if we get distracted and just caught up in routines and everything, almost might as well not be there. Self-consciousness allows us to see what we are doing and not just do it. See what we are thinking and not just think. See how we're perceiving and not just perceive. That makes the big difference, and that's where the responsibility comes in. We're a part of evolution, and now we've got a job to do. Because we can consciously see what's going on and make choices. Now, that doesn't mean we're all knowing or anything. And like with any system, any way of looking at the world, it involves experience, knowledge, and conviction of things that one can't claim to know, but one believes are true. Self-consciousness turned within, as John was talking about, is where we begin to look at inner experience. In Buddhism, I don't remember what the Sanskrit is, but it's usually translated the turning about of consciousness, where consciousness begins to examine itself. That's what self-consciousness can do. And then it can do two things. One, it can ask, why is it thinking these things? Why is it doing these things? and for what purpose, and adjust those. And it can also trace the causes back as to why we have tendencies to do this and that and so on. And we can understand, even if we don't directly experience right away, we can understand what this idea that all humanity, indeed all nature, is ultimately one. And as the Buddha said, and very early on, you find it in the Pali texts, um, take what I said, but test it in your experience. Don't just believe it because somebody you respect said it. And obviously that takes work. Once again, self-consciousness is involved. Because am I really testing something? Or am I just bringing my own presuppositions and history and habit patterns to it and thinking, I'm really looking at it. So our experience we can examine. All of these things, which both allow, as Pico said, turning to the angels instead of the animals, occur in the human being, but that means we have to do it. And so John mentioned that phrase from Helena Blavatsky's Secret Doctrine, self-induced and self-devised efforts. So one of the ideas in theosophy is, stop looking for a savior. Yes, look for people wiser than you and learn from them.
Well, in Buddhism,
reconsider your experience so that even people you don't like teach you. Simple example, as you might have guessed, I did not vote for our current president. And I can get very frustrated by things going on, bombing boats of Venezuelans who may or may not be carrying drugs and so on. But then the question becomes, why am I frustrated? Why am I annoyed? Put another way, since humanity is one, what is it in me that things I see out there trigger? If I didn't have those things in me, I wouldn't even be able to recognize them. Jesus said, take the before you remove the mote from somebody else's eye, take the beam out of yours.
Jesus,
big mote, the log out of yours is what the Greek says.
Jesus died to
Pardon?
die to live.
Yes.
Die first. Now, in Buddhism, it says much more: turn yourself about, confront
Yes.
your own self nature,
Yes.
nature that is no nature.
Yes.
That's a critical thing, because as you talk about the self, that we turn away from too, and at that move between the self and somehow the non-self, the ego being dead, that becomes something that, on the one hand, I think is where we're getting into the spirituality, and on the second hand, I'm going, I don't know how trees and animals experience that differently, because their self has been cast away too. So what is it that's now beyond the self?
Bingo. In theosophy, it's called the one life. And there is that beyond that. But the one life is the whole living existence of the universe. But that's not the ultimate source. I've been using the word source only for not having to try to use technical terms. Because as Marianne said, there's a lot of technical terms, like any tradition has. I'm sorry, Cliff, you were.
Well, I'm just aware of the clock. It's ticking, and
Oh,
I see Deshane with a big smile on his face. I thought maybe he wanted to throw a thought in here before Renee likes to be punctual, so
Yes.
or Donna or anyone else like to step up before I am forced to close the meeting?
I just want to say Duchesne's sweatshirt says it all,
I
because
would,
that can have several meanings. It says simplify, simplify. And
there was one experience
there
I
goes yourselves, different conceptions of self right there. I'm sorry, you're going to say something, Duchesne?
I was going to share one small experience, and um, one of the thoughts about ascending and descending in the simplest of form is our breath, breathing in and breathing out. And there is a sacred pause in between, which is one of the places in Taoist philosophy we teach about effortlessness.
Mm.
And one small example of experience in nature there, we had recently been to see the Purple Valley butterflies in the morning. And the moment we reached there, all the butterflies were just sleeping in the morning at 6:50 in the morning. And we were curious, like, where are all the butterflies? Why are they not up yet? We are here by 6:30. And so we decided to go and meditate for 10 minutes, and we sat there just focusing on the breath, breathing in and out, and our eyes were closed. And after 10-15 minutes we felt the sun warmth, the rays of the warmth fell from the valley, and there was this inner knowing that happened that, oh, it's time to awake now.
Hmm.
And I open my eyes and I look around. All the butterflies are flying around from nowhere within a split of a second. And that knowing, that feeling of warmth just ignited an awakening, not only for ourselves, but also for all the nature. And in that moment, I thought about, oh, wow, I knew the answer, but I didn't know the answer. And the only way to find it out was to go into that moment of stillness. And the breath is going in and out at its own
Mm.
pace. However, you become an observer of that, and you will find all the answers from that
Mm.
self-awareness perspective, a self-observer standpoint, and you will find all the answers you want. Now, the question is, what do you do with that? That is where I feel that as a conscious being, you have a role to play to either expand that consciousness to help everyone awake, or you create ways to kind of, I think, yeah, so helping expand that consciousness that can help us propel in the right direction. So a small example from nature, which I thought was going along the same lines which you were explaining it.
Mm.
I
Mahalo.
think, Shane, I think that's
Thank you.
a wonderful thing to bring things full circle in the meeting. And so I'm just going to kind of say a few things to close the meeting out. In that first, both Elton and John did not pull any punches. There was a lot here to unpack, and maybe some people might feel a little bit overwhelmed by it. But I think one of the essences of theosophy is questioning. It's not about belief. It's about thinking, questioning. And one of the joys I think that Duchesne is saying is the more one tries to understand one's own consciousness and being a self-conscious being, the more as we go into nature, we understand that we start to feel or see that all of nature is conscious, like the butterflies. The experience that the epiphany experience you were having that morning was expanding your own consciousness into the consciousness of all. And one of the quotes that Elton gave early on from a teacher that all of us had in Santa Barbara, Professor Iyer, you gave a quote that said, "The whole universe is a kaleidoscopic reflection of divine thought in divine mind." So it's like when we're looking at the universe or the world around us, it is thought. It's manifested thought, and we're challenged to participate in that. And that the whole idea of concentration, as John was saying, is a centripetal force in us to pull our thought into a concentrated way. That's real meditation. That's real concentration. And by doing that, we are engaged in not just our own self-evolution through willpower, but the evolution of all. And one quote from I heard from Professor Iyer numerous times is that we should use our mind, we should squeeze our mind like an orange until the pips squeak. That was one of his favorite little quotes. And so that's the challenge to us, not to have belief, but not to get stuck into materialized thinking. We know just intuitively that we're mind beings, we're spiritual beings. So all of these thoughts or all these ideas that we're sharing here, they're not offensive to reason. If anything is offensive to reason, it's not theosophical. And theosophy is really the teachings of great beings throughout history. It's not some modern thing. So if it doesn't suit your intuition, it doesn't sit well with you, then it's not something that anyone's encouraging you to think about. But these are challenging ideas. The whole idea of involution, evolution, super high bar. I was surprised Renee included it in the almanac, and Elton and John came and blew the ball out of the park. And so I just want to thank both of them so much, and all of you for enduring that very challenging Gems from the Wisdom Traditions presentation.
Well, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much, Cliff. And Deshaun and Bob and others too. They've already left. So we really appreciated hearing from you.
Yes, thank you.
All right. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Take care.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.